because they keep referring back to LQM, was criticised by LQM, and LQM did have concerns about whether that made the whole thing viable, whether there were other areas of higher gas that could render it going up from a moderate to high gas risk characterisation. The way that was analysed, and the way that Geodyne looked at the grass screening value as their main interpretation of the gas regime, was not the way that others would have done it, and certainly in terms of the toxic gases, there were levels of toxic gas that would certainly push it up into towards a high level of gas regime. And high levels of gas regime sites are not usually moderate to high characterised situation for, are not usually, you don't usually put houses on them, because the amount of protection needed is so expensive, it's not usually even viable to put houses on. But in their assessment, we can speak for themselves, they put a level of screening for the VOCs themselves in 10 parts per million. I can tell you we've done many investigations, and I wrote it in the report. The site which was supposed to have organic materials in it, which produced VOCs, 40 years after it had been tipped, with 10 ppm in it, is relatively high. I mean, over 10 ppm. I mean, even over sort of 1, 2 is relatively high. These are levels of VOCs more normally associated with like a petrol filling station or depot that's been abandoned for many years, where there was a significant amount of hydrocarbon in the ground, not with a site. And the instruments used, from what I can gather, were screened so that they gave a realistic reading of VOCs, not one that was mixed with methane.
Okay, so there's two things there, there's ground gases and vapours. So the summary is, there is residual risk in the ground from that, and we've recommended robust remedial precautions to overcome those risks. Just in relation to the ground gases, quite a detailed assessment of the results in our report. 75% of the readings that we've got in the wells would be characterised as CS1 being no precautions are required. For the 9 of the wells, 22.5% of those constructed would be CS2, which is where you adopt some precautions, and then on one occasion, which was borehole 6, resulted in CS3 classification. The CS3 already had robust remedial measures adopted at the site. Part of the second phase of works was to go out and actually assess the ground gases in that area in a bit more detail. So we put shallow wells in to see if there's ground gases at the surface. We put deeper wells in to see where the source of ground gas was actually coming from. All of the results that we found generally indicated it was a localised thing to that borehole 6. What's of note in terms of the characteristic situation classification, which is CS classes, is that we have recommended CS3 precautions across the entirety of the site, based on one elevated value on one borehole. So, it's quite robust remedial precautions we're recommending. In terms of the vapours, noted, Mr. Fry's right, we did find PID readings above implementation of the instrumentation. Ground gases, given the presence of the methane and the carbon dioxide, are considered perhaps the more key risk driver for assessment purposes. But again, the provision of CS3 precautions allow for a vapour-resistant membrane. So you have an aluminium laminate membrane in there, part of your remedial construction, which helps to prevent migration.
No use of possible.
Can I just say, how would that help people off-site? Obviously, you're going to protect people on the site. How is that going to affect people who live in the immediate vicinity? You're not going to be able to put a membrane on the land.
You have to appreciate that our remit is the site, and it's a planning matter.
You have to appreciate we were there first.
If I can just finish. Our brief as a consultant is to work with a client to look at the development of a new site, and that's subject to the planning regime. If it is a matter of an existing site and existing houses, that's a matter for what's called Part 2A, which is a local council matter. So if they have significant concern about adjacent properties, then it's a council matter, not a consultant matter.
So what, can I ask you that question?
Can I just make a point back on what you said? In terms, what concerns me is that these VOCs are not tied into contaminants within the ground. That's what concerns me. They are widespread across the site. There are a number number of boreholes that found these VOCs. I think relatively significant levels. Anything above 1, 2, I would say on a site at this age would be significant. You may argue about that, but there's a lot of figures here, 20s, 50s, 20s, 26.8 in one occasion, 32.7. What is not here is tying what the source of the VOCs are to the VOCs. And when I went back and looked at the analysis, of course, the monitoring is obviously from the monitoring well. So, look at the analysis. There's not an inordinate amount of analysis looking for trying to tie this together. What I was looking for, sort of, and I should have thought would have been was you have some gases. Characterise gases with your risk assessment. I may disagree with that, but you've not tied it to anything. What is the source? And if you're not able to tie it to anything, do you not think you might have missed the source?
We did actually discuss that in the problems of ground gas section of the report. There's a section in the report which does discuss that.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
There's a section in the report, the ground gas assessment report, which talks about the provenance of the ground gases that we found. So
yeah, you dismiss it. That's what I'm saying, you dismissed it.
We haven't dismissed anything, we've assessed it and addressed it as part of the design of the remediation strategy. The remediation strategy is designed to address issues of ground gases
Cheap as possible.
And that's managed by inclusion of a membrane in the buildings which protects the building from the gases.
I appreciate you discuss it in terms of the risk assessment. What I'm saying is you don't tie it to a source. There's then nobody going back to whether to look at whether or not you have characterised the sources consistently enough. This is the point I've made. I'm not arguing about a risk assessment other than the ground gas risk assessment. I think you put that down as characteristic situation 2, and most everybody else puts it a characteristic situation 3 or higher.
Correct you straight there, we've gone for CS3 across the entire site.
Maybe
We've not attempted to zone the site or delimit any areas. We've adopted high-end robust measures across the entire site.
Could you just clarify for me, is CS3 the highest category?
It's CS1 is do nothing, CS2 is basic protection, CS3 is more robust protection with independent verification, CS4 is either don't put houses on it or before you put houses on it, additional interventions are required to remove the gas source.
Yeah, sorry.
So,
Anyway.
yes, I think, okay, do you have any further comments about, so this is a question about the characterisation of the sources of the VOCs.
We've adopted a broad brush screening. We use the PID on soil samples and on the boreholes precisely to get an understanding of the levels that are present in the ground. That was what the work was undertaken to do. We did also test for hydrocarbons in the ground, but didn't particularly find much. So there may potentially be pockets of VOCs in the ground that we've captured in our boreholes, but we have assessed that in all the boreholes and we have put in place measures to address it.
As I said before, the amount of testing you did is inadequate for this job. My opinion. VOCs are an issue because they are quite widespread and there is nothing that ties them to a source of contamination within the ground. Had there been something tied to a source of contamination that could have then been assessed, then we'd be having a different discussion. Potentially, we may not be having a discussion at all. I do not believe this has been characterised sufficiently. Risk assessment on it, I believe, is weak. Therefore, I would say that is, and LQN, if they had any criticism of your report, criticise this by basically saying, just because you haven't found things higher doesn't mean they don't exist.
And that's why they've requested additional monitoring as part of outline planning.
But monitoring's only on the same locations, isn't it?
That's not what it says.
So you're going back to do more investigation?
Outline planning requires it, yes.
Is there a possibility that further monitoring in future could reveal higher levels of VOCs and potentially going up to CS4?
Well, the VOCs aren't assessed in the CS characterisation, so that's a different assessment. But yeah, we have said in our report that based on the worst case methane and the worst case flow, that we are near the threshold between CS3 and CS4. But we've also highlighted in our report that all the other values are CS2 and CS1. So we have in our own sensitivity analysis acknowledged that we are close to the boundary of CS4, but we've also highlighted the fact that it's in one hole, and the subsequent holes, which I would highlight, were agreed with Amber Valley, which were deep and shallow adjacent to that anomalous reading, revealed low levels, so it does appear to be isolated to that area. LQM, the two main areas that they focused on in terms of their planning condition requirements were the need to investigate shallow coal, and as part of that investigation assess the gas from the shallow coal as a potential issue, and as part of that assessment include further gas monitoring at site. And those are recommendations from LQM to AVBC in respect to the outline planning.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry, I didn't see that turn into a condition. There was more investigation.
I understand that's a condition suggested by the council.
There's conditions on the council that are appropriate. I didn't see a condition that more investigation could be taken. My understanding was the basis of this is that it was agreed by the scientific officer and yourselves that sufficient characterisation had been done on the site in order to grant outline planning permission. If the investigation themselves say that more investigation is to be done, then I don't understand why that's not being done.
I think the situation there is that it has been agreed that sufficient investigation has been done to grant outline planning condition with appropriate conditions for supplementary investigations at the site relating to coal and ground gases. That's what LQM said in this letter. So there's no, I'll read it again. Consequently, on balance, it would seem reasonable for the council to condition any outline planning permission it decides to grant. These conditions should ensure that shallow mine working investigation recommended by Doixin is conducted and provided to the council, that the nature of any vapour contamination is further delineated, that the ground gas risk assessment is updated in light of the mine workings investigation and the proposed foundation design, and that subsequently full and comprehensive design report is prepared as per BS 8485. So that's LQM's concluding comment. It's not being hidden or it's in the document.
Yeah. Sorry.
We haven't seen that.
Sorry, sir, we'll go on to conditions subsequently, but I think it's condition 4 is relevant.
Could you answer the question, did you find a source of the VOCs? Have you a source for these VOCs?
Specifically on site, it's more diffuse than anything else. There's no specific hydrocarbons in the ground that we found that would result in the VOC concentrations coming out above the detection. We've got the values, and we've looked at the values, and we've derived appropriate mitigation on the basis of what we've found.
So your conclusion is there is no source for these VOCs?
Yeah, we just concluded that it's a diffuse source throughout the body of the site. What we've said is, as a responsible consultant, that we've monitored not only soil samples, but the boreholes for the presence of vapours. We've taken that on board and recommended an appropriate mitigation. So we've not tested for it, we've tested for it, we found, they're not zero, but they're not high levels of the petrol stations with much higher values than that.
Some of these levels are high enough to be on a petrol station, I can assure you that. And I do not accept that they are a diffuse source. There is a source of hydrocarbons there leading to this. There must be. They are far too high for there not to be a source.
Could those, what you're talking about, could those be related to regular shipments from Stanlow oil refinery to that site, Mr. Fryer?
Well, there is suspicion that the site was illegally checked. There is suspicion that materials, including oils and sludges, were tipped on site and would give great hydrocarbons, and they have widespread across the site, relatively, for its age of the site, relatively high levels of hydrocarbon in a site which was inert, or supposedly inert, or at least had non-hazardous waste. Yes.
Could you explain?
They are most likely associated, and I said that. These elevated VOC recording the gas one, coupled with the spread and consistency of the readings across the site, indicate there probably is some residues of liquid fuels and oil derivatives within the waste material that are actively biodegrading even after the greater than 30 years the landfill has been closed.
Could you expect, just answer me a question? Seeing as water levels are rising, the groundwater levels are rising in this area, which we know they are because Severn Trent have had problems further up with cellars flooding, and then deemed it isn't their responsibility as it isn't their pipeway. How do you say you protect the house through a membrane? How does it protect the residents on that side in the gardens from anything else that is forced up through the water level rising? How do you do that?
Just coming back to that, I mean, one of the main things we talked about is Doixin and ferns. One of the things we discussed is they're not mobile in water. That's one response. The second response is that we've recommended a 1 metre remedial capping for the site, which means the site will be 1 metre higher than it is at the moment. So given that we've not really found any continuous water within the landfill at the moment, the fact that we're raising those by a further metre and further protecting against any such concerns in that matter.
Do you not accept that people buying 4 to 5 bed luxury homes may wish to plant fruit trees in their garden, and they may wish to eat apples, plums, pears, and that the average root length of a mature apple tree is 25 feet below the ground? Now ultimately, via osmosis, anything in the ground will be drawn to the surface and put into the fruit. If the fruit is eaten, there is a cause and effect.
Just to address that, the contaminated land guidance, the framework that we work within, deals with the 1 metre capping as being a break between the source of contamination and the receptor. That's based on US EPA guidance and UK guidance, and that's the value that's adopted. What we're doing as consultants is implementing UK guidance. So it's not our opinion about the capping, it's UK guidance that we're implementing. The contaminated land exposure assessment model, the CLEAR model, looks at the top 1 metre. Stephen will accept that. It looks at the 1 metre as the zone of contamination that's going to mobilise or affect people. So when we are providing recommendations, we're providing recommendations in accordance with accepted good practice.
Can somebody here answer me the question? At the present time, if there is anything happens from these sites before they touch, like now, who is responsible for these sites? LOM, LS01, LS42, who is responsible for these sites right now?
You have a residual, you got hold of them, which is the I don't know.
Cameras still on?
I don't know. No, I doubt that. I doubt cameras.
Because I understand that was there not a law where the licences were surrendered and the local authority took responsibility?
The local authority takes responsibility. Whoever owns them, whoever took responsibility of them, they become legacy sites under the council. If nobody owns them, they become legacy sites and the council has to deal with them.
So if there is gas present on site, then why is the Borough Council not doing anything as regards venting them or anything like that? Why is that not taking place? Because it happened at Gloucester, it could happen at Lower Somercotes.
Short answer, because nothing's happening with the sites at present.
Nobody's checking whether anything's
Well,
happening, that's the case.
Nobody is doing anything with the site other than the site sitting where it is at the moment, is the short answer.
But do the local Borough Council have a responsibility to a duty of care to the public?
Can you answer that? I mean, not for the environment, for the council.
Council don't own the site, it's as far as I'm aware.
Can't hear you.
So the council don't own the site, they're not responsible for the site.
And yet there's a
People
footpath
who are
across the top
responsible
of it.
for the site are the people that tip the waste in.
But were not the licences
current
surrendered, and
licenses.
does it not fall on the local authority? Is that correct, Mr. Friday?
That's automatically to a local authority now.
Right, so Amber
We
Valley
don't
Borough
get
Council,
ownership of a disused waste site now.
so you are not responsible for the public relating to gases emitting from any of those sites then? You are not responsible for that? You've got no duty of care to the residents of that area? Is that what you're
There's a
saying?
regulatory regime under Part 2A of the Environmental Protection Act that says we can take action if we satisfy there's a significant risk of significant harm to people in the locality from contamination in the area.
Right.
But that needs to be demonstrated as a significant risk. But we don't automatically take ownership of any site, we don't take responsibility for management of any site. that doesn't automatically pass the council.
Right. Well,
Okay, I think that, can we just, if we could discuss the proposed development, it's in outline at the moment, no details of the development. So the groundworks and the foundations and works will alter the structure of the ground, obviously. Will that affect the pathways? Will that affect the movement of water? I appreciate it's not the precise way in which that would happen is not known at the moment, but if the appellant could just sort of outline the effects of that.
One thing I'll discuss then is that obviously one of the things we're going to investigate is the issue of shallow mining. If there are work seams beneath the site, then LOSCO, as a case in point, was migration through, I think, workings and permeable seams.
it's riddled with mine workings under there.
Great. Then we'll investigate that and it'll be stabilised. And stabilised involves injection of a cement bentonite grout into the void, and that cement bentonite void stabilises the ground by filling it up. So at the moment, if there are open voids underneath that site, then the investigation of that matter and the stabilisation of those voids significantly retard the movement of water through that area, because it will be drawn, grouted and stabilised. So if at the moment it is worked, and if in the future it is stabilised, that will provide a betterment. So that's a positive impact.
To what depth do you envisage that would be?
We typically investigate 30 metres below ground. This site is slightly different in that we have a significant depth of layground overlying that. So we'll investigate a greater depth of 30 metres to look for work coal.
There is in the documentation, we've got documentation somewhere that there is one of the main coal faces from Low Bay to Colliery runs right under that site. That won't be at low level. That'll be significantly deeper.
No, that's a matter for the coal board really, or the coal authority. I mean, the work we undertake, it's related to the potential for shallow workings to collapse and to get crown holes on the surface, which when you have heavy periods of rain, you get on the news where a garden's collapsed or things
So
like
what
that.
you're saying then at deep level, if it collapses, nothing happens on surface?
What happens, I can go technical, is that if you have a seam that's been worked, it is generally taken that what happens is the seam, so if there's a void of rock above it, the seam starts spalling and collapsing into the void beneath it. The collapse process isn't perfect, in other words, it doesn't collapse in perfectly. So if you imagine marbles in a jar, it collapses in and there are voids between the collapse pockets. What happens is that the creation of the voids bulks up the soil as it collapses in, and it's generally deemed that by the time the worked seam is 10 times seam thickness of competent rock below the ground, so a 1 metre seam 10 metres down, greater than that depth, it's deemed that the collapse of the void, or the rock into the void, will have choked itself up as it migrates upwards, so that basically the clasts of rock and the voids, the bulking factor of the voids will then self-support the roof and it won't collapse. So in the assessment that we undertake, we look at the coal seam from both published records and from site-based records. We adopt the thickest of those records as the seam thickness, and then we apply the 10 times seam thickness rule to that, and if it's within 10 times seam thickness of rock, so in this instance below the base of the landfill, it will then be drawn and grouted. Because if you don't do that, then it risks the migration of voids coming to the surface. So coal is a specific thing that we need to investigate, but the method of treating that coal is, or sorry, the workings of coal is that the ground is grouted. It's grouted and it's verified, and that is submitted to the coal authority, and that is included in any future reports.
So do you concede then that you're saying that there's no proof of pathways from LS01 and LOM, then old coal seams, old coal tunnels, could they be pathways to the site?
Coal seams do act as a migration mechanism, yeah, I wouldn't deny that, but as we've just discussed, what will be undertaken is an investigation. If there are any seams within influencing depth that could affect the development in terms of stability, they will be stabilised, and that stabilisation process will serve to reduce the potential for any contaminants to migrate. We also need to consider that the coal we're talking about might be 30 or 40 metres below ground. We have already assessed the site for methane, which can be associated with coal seam workings. So again, stabilisation will mitigate against that to some degree.
So what do you do about coal seams and old tunnels that are not on record with the Coal Authority, because they don't hold all records?
The work we undertake is to drill the site. You have seams that are known to have been worked, and you have seams which have been worked in other areas that may have been worked under the site that we're looking at. When we do what's called a consultant's report for a site, the Coal Authority will give us records that basically look at the geology, look at the seams beneath the site. If they have no direct records relating to whether they've been worked or not, the report flags up the fact that that seam has been worked in other areas in the locality, and that triggers the need to investigate. On this site, that has been triggered, so we have recommended in our report the need to investigate for workings within coal, and the Coal Authority have accepted that and recommended that our recommendations are adopted. So in terms of the coal itself, it's an investigation to be undertaken, and the mechanism to address the concerns from that are to stabilise it.
I just wanted to emphasise that, you know, it could be a potential pathway underneath the site.
And it's something that we've taken seriously. Within our report, we've got geology maps that show the coal seam outcropping. We've done a coal search, and the Coal Authority have adopted our recommendations. And we do have a lot of experience of investigating shallow mining.
There was recently a collapse down at the lower end of that site. The Coal Authority came out, and they were very good. You know, it's happened in a couple of places down towards the bottom of LS01. You know, I'm quite impressed with the records that they hold. But you know, there was a depression on the surface there.
Yeah, and that's exactly what these works are designed to deal with, is that, as I say, the problem you have is that a coal seam doesn't collapse, you don't see it at the surface until it's worked all the way up.
Yeah.
Old seams could have been stabilised with pit props that have taken 50 years to rot, and then they collapse, and then the seam comes down. But the reason this 10 times seam thickness rule is adopted, it is based on research, and it basically chokes off and self-supports at that depth. But what we do is we drill the first few holes to a greater depth, establish a seam of concern, and then the remaining holes go to generally 1 metre below the seam of concern.
So then, if you have got an old mining tunnel, coal face, that is under that site, and you deem that there is a void there and that is where gas is emitting to, you've got to drill down to that passageway to fill it with grout, as you say. So by drilling down to that passageway, are you not opening up that potential passageway for dioxins or whatever up to the surface? How do you safeguard that?
Again, I don't see how dioxins can migrate to the surface from 40 metres down particularly.
Let's get away from that.
Well, if you're drilling and there's, as Mr. Fry said, and there's soil coming up or gravel coming up, could it not be in that?
There is a slight water flush, sometimes arrives at the surface, but dioxin.
The smallest amount of this dioxin is dead.
Well, the whole point of a risk assessment is to examine the concentrations that you have in the context of that. We haven't found any levels that exceed, as a toxicity assessment that we've undertaken, that exceed that threshold.
I'm just emphasising that you said that there's no evidence of pathways.
No.
Well, if you've got coal seams running underneath the site and coal tunnels, then there is potential pathways, big pathways, because if that waste has been buried above it, chances are it's in them tunnels. And
I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. It depends on the position of the coal seam and things.
No, you don't agree with it because you're working for Mr.
No, I'm a chartered engineer and I have an opinion. And
yeah, but you don't know.
If the workings intercept the base of the open cast, then there is a potential for them for any contamination to be in them. If the workings are 20 metres below the base of the open cast, then it's very unlikely they're going to be in it. So it depends on the context.
Well,
you
you
need to
don't
investigate
know
that context.
You can't guarantee that.
I can't guarantee that, but what we don't know at the moment is if it works or not. So is it not better to investigate it and find out what is down there than not investigate it?
I'm just trying to emphasise to the people in this room that the history of that site and that there is potential for pathways to be running underneath that site through old coal workings, regardless of ground movements or water movements, that it could already be happening. You're saying earlier on, you said it was doubtful that there was any pathways. We've got no evidence of pathways.
There are no evidence of pathways to affect the site being investigated.
Appreciated. It is, for the man in the street, it's quite difficult to understand. Not everybody understands it.
I fully appreciate that, and that is why, whilst reports are being criticised, everything that we have found is within the reports that we've prepared, and that has been peer reviewed by LQM, and I keep saying that is the situation. We work our way through the risks. We have to investigate the coal at a later date. What I would say, irrespective of anything there, is that the drilling will take place before the provision of the remedial capping. The remedial capping will go on top of the site as it stands at the moment. So there will be 1 metre imported capping from an approved source placed. So even in the unlikely event that anything migrates, and I'll challenge that as well, the site will also have an additional 1 metre capping.
Something that's recently come to light, because there's a possibility of several more residential developments, and I must admit it's something we've always been quite concerned about, and we've had Coal Authority input on this, is it's recently come to light that at the bottom of LS01, on a public footpath, there are 3 mine shafts. It's also come to light that obviously liquids, fluids, water runs downhill, it goes to lower points. What's interesting is we've now found out that how deep these mine shafts are. So are you actually saying then that the developer will be responsible for physically removing any fluid that are in these 2 mine shafts and the safe disposal thereof? So you uncap it, you sample it, oh, we've got a problem. Who's going to pay to remediate it?
Dave's just checking the report, but to my knowledge there are no mine shafts on
There
the
are,
site.
100%. And what's more interesting, and this is interesting, when we went with the Coal Authority inspector to show him this bit of land, and we both looked at this very strange inverted cone shape in the ground, the inspector just sucked his thumb and said, well, do you know what? I don't really want to make a comment, but it's obvious that shouldn't be there. So what I'm trying to say is, it's got to go somewhere, and it's got to go to the lowest point to get into the water courses, but I think, because of the mine shafts, I think it's congregating somewhere, and it's going to be an extremely dangerous toxic mix. So when and if you discover it, who is responsible for remediating it?
Sorry, I'm still looking through the records here. Can you tell us where these shafts are then?
They're at the bottom of LS01, on the footpath, and there's 2 mine shafts.
LS01 isn't our site.
Interestingly, you keep saying that, and I think it's interesting when the inspector does the walk. LS01 is above your site, and if it flows one way, it must flow the other way. So logic says on your side, which is your site, where is it going in the ground?
So just for clarity, you've just said that there are shafts on our site, and now you're saying they're not
No,
on
I'm
our
not.
site.
You're twisting
No,
what
what
I've
I'm
just
saying-
I'm not
said.
twisting your words. You
You
said
are
they were
twisting
on
what
our
I've just
site.
said. What I said was quite clear. At the bottom of LS01, on a public footpath, there were 2 mine shafts. They've got to be the lowest point of ground. There must be the equivalent on your side.
Are you saying adjacent to Smotherfly?
No, I'm saying at the bottom of
What
LS01.
we're saying is if there's 2 mine shafts at the bottom of LOM, the chances are that potentially the mining tunnels running right underneath the site. So obviously, them tunnels, where does your, if you're going to grout or fill these voids, if they're causing a problem, where does your responsibility end? How far are you?
Our work's related to our site.
Just relating to your site.
That's the work we undertake.
Right. So obviously, if that is coming underneath your site and there's a small amount of venting going on, and you stop that venting, it's going to come up elsewhere. So who is responsible for that site then? I mean, we're residents, we live near these sites, and you know, the Borough Council seem to just absolve the responsibility for these sort of things. You know, you can't even find out what happened as regards the sale of this site or how they came into ownership of it. On the nights of the consultation, you've got the head of the council helping the developer set up. It creates an air of suspicion, you know, and as residents, we have no confidence in the Borough Council.
And fundamentally, Pye Bridge is below the site. So for the Pye Bridge residents, you know, they're potentially at great risk.
And I'm the first house below.
It's cause and effect. It's got to go somewhere.
It does. I live in Pye Bridge. I got a letter in 1979 addressed to Camrose from a Mr. Orman Roy about the flooding issue on Camrose and what's he going to do with it.
Can I take a note of your 2 names, please?
My name's Diana Dixon.
Right.
Mrs. Judson.
Okay, well I think, does the panel have any further comments on that point?
Can I just ask a question? So genuinely don't understand this, so please can help me. if you're building it at 1 metre, which is about 3 foot, 3'3". So, how are you going to come out onto the road? Are you going to come down a dip onto the road? You know, if your site's been built up, you're going to come out on the main B600, which is one of the busiest roads in Derbyshire. I live on it. But I can't, you know, if you're building up a metre, putting your houses on top of a metre, you've got your rugby field, you're going up a metre, you're putting a house on, so consequently it's going to, are you building that metre up to the edge of the road and then going down into the road?
That's ultimately the detailed design, but what normally happens is if you don't put the house right adjacent to the road, so there's an opportunity to grade levels as they come back
So
down.
anything on there is going to flow down the road. 'Cause when it rains, it comes off the rugby club and floods through our village. It is a very, very, very busy road, that. The second busiest road. I live in Pye Bridge, and nothing to do with it, but both sides of the road, people have got to park on the pavement to have flow of traffic. And it does worry me.
I'm a geologist, so I'm dealing with the geological and contamination
Yeah, that's
matters.
fine.
Yeah, we'll come on to these other points.
All I was on about was those metre height and then grading down.
All I can say to that is the site would have a drainage strategy. So, you know, the drainage strategy would serve to drain the site.
Can I make one last point on this? I accept that there were some comments in the LQM report relating to investigating, but I didn't see in the conditions or in that there was a requirement to do that investigation, absolute requirement to do the investigation. Conditions suggested other things might be done, but it wasn't saying you will carry out an investigation. I didn't see a greater condition that said that. But given that you are going to do this investigation of the coal seas regime, and part of that is to clarify or add to your gas regime, your gas risk assessment. Yes, phase 4. I just want to make sure that is part of its remit.
The remit is post-plan, but
It is to do with the gas regime, part of the investigation of it.
it's written on the document, yeah.
And give it right, and there's a possibility that that might therefore put the gas regime up a level. You'd accept that. Is this investigation, is this development viable with gas, a CS4 situation? Because if it is in any way in doubt, in LQM suggests that if it was CS4 it might be in doubt, why are you not doing the investigation now?
Because we've taken 2 phases of investigation, both of which have been agreed with LQM, to investigate the site and bring it to its current level of knowledge. LQM wants us to pick up the issues associated with mine gas, and that will be picked up post-planning, but the work we've undertaken was undertaken in consultation with LQM. As Dave's alluded to previously, we've already, in our gas report, in the sensitivity analysis, actually referenced the fact that if the flow rates went up higher, that it could go outside CS3, so we've not hidden that fact, but we've also shown that the majority of the site, from the majority of data, is CS1, that the in-between data is CS2, but that's about a third, and we only have 1 CS3. So at the moment, it's not as though the whole site is assessed as CS3 in terms of the data around the site, but we provide a blanket CS3 assessment to the whole site. We do need to do, as required by LQM, further investigation, but there are, if it is an anomalous area and that is the only area, that area can be ventilated. So what we're talking about is a phased investigation working through the areas of concern, the matters of concern. We consider, and LQM has concluded, that at the point in time now, with the information that is available, it is reasonable to provide suitably conditioned outline planning. That's the conclusion based on the work we've undertaken in consultation with LQM.
Well, they had 2 points, didn't they? There was the gas regime and then there's the vapours. We're alluded that the vapours are relatively high. I assure you, you would not want to live with 2 parts per million VOCs in your house. You wouldn't. It would begin to affect you, not necessarily in terms of health, but just as a nuisance. You would be smelling it and it would become quite unpleasant. They were critical of both these areas. They basically said in terms of the vapours, just because you haven't found it doesn't mean there are higher areas. Your vapour risk assessment I do not believe to be robust. Certainly, if I had done a vapour risk assessment, I would come to maybe some different conclusions, but that's not what's being presented. I'm saying there are 2 areas here that need further investigation. I can understand why these have not been investigated. prior to this.
Sorry, you can't understand why they haven't been investigated. They
Yes,
have
there
been
are two areas that LQ our criticism on. One,
I'm sorry, but the first 10 holes we did were with the council's agreement. The design of the supplementary holes around BH6 were undertaken with the council and LQM's agreement, and those results interpreted in tandem with the council and LQM. So we've not hidden any data or designed the work on our own. We have done it in tandem with LQM, and it isn't being challenged.
well, they've said the vapours assessment is not, so it's not adequate. They said that there are questions over it, and they've questioned the VOCs. That has been there from quite some time ago. Why has not subsequent investigations been done to answer at least LQM's criticism?
The second investigation was a subsequent investigation. That's point two. You talked about you'd be worried about 2 ppm of vapour in your building. Point one, buildings will have robust gas protection that's very validated. Therefore, that will serve to exclude that. And secondly, you need to know what type of vapour it is before you know the 2 ppm is an issue or not. But the whole point of the gas protection system that's validated is to protect the building.
So what happens if you shed one night and you get gas? How about that? Could happen, wouldn't it?
You're asking me to speculate, but a shed is typically
You're
a
not
wooden
protected
structure
there,
that's
are
very
you?
well
The
ventilated.
only protected place is the house. Everywhere else you're gardening, everywhere else you're in danger.
Garden will vent freely to atmosphere if there's any issue, but as we pointed out, go back to it, the majority of the site is CS1, which is do nothing. So we haven't tried to zone the site to do nothing, do a bit, do a lot. We
The
take a
majority of the
precautionary
site
approach.
is CS1 with respect to toxic gases, with moderate to moderately high VOCs. Your risk assessment of VOCs is not robust enough. These were criticised by LQM in a letter of the 7th of July. That is 2016. That is after the date of all the testing. Why has subsequently nothing been done about that? Why has that not been followed up? It's no good saying, oh, LQM agreed it. They did not agree it.
They didn't.
No, what they agreed is we'd taken the site to a sufficient point in time where any residual concerns could be addressed by outline planning. That's what their conclusion says, and that's the position. I'm sorry, but it's that is the nub of the matter, is that LQM concluded that the site can be developed subject to suitably conditioned planning that addresses residual concerns. That's where we are.
Okay, well, we agree to disagree on that point then.
You disagreeing with us and LQM then?
Yes, and with LQM then.
And the planning board refused it 3 times.
On the basis of this lack of information. That was
Yeah.
what they refused it on.
Lack of
They
information.
did not accept that there was enough information. I did not even know that was the reason until I received the information on. I looked at your reports. I did not look at the minutes until yesterday. I was quite surprised actually that the reason they refused it, they come to the same conclusion. There was a lack of information on the site. It is no wrong robust enough. So we do disagree on that. I do not believe that Paul Nathaniel is either a site investigation expert, he is an environmental risk assessment expert. So he wouldn't know necessarily about other techniques and investigation techniques that could have been applied more robustly to this site. Nor is he necessarily someone who's designed an awful lot of site investigations. He runs a risk assessment company and is Professor of Environmental Risk at Nottingham University. I can't remember which one, to be honest. So I do disagree with that.
I think the conclusion there is a risk assessment company, they agree with our risk assessments and then suitable remedial action can be adopted. So ultimately, that's
Nobody
that point.
is arguing with that.
That's the whole
It's
point
data.
of the site, isn't it? That it can be remediated to a suitable standard, suitable for use in accordance with the MPPF document. That's what we're trying to achieve.
Only if
I'd
you
also
clarify.
think that Paul Nathaniel would take issues with your characterisation of the viewers here.
Why isn't he here?
Again, not my remit.
That old chestnut.
Sorry, sir, can we just, obviously to point to the fact that in terms of the...
I'll let,
just deal with that.
let me just respond to that point first, yeah.
Yeah, in terms of the evidence presented to the planning committee meetings, that was the work undertaken by Geodyne and the peer review by LQM, who are renowned experts in the field. That was the evidence that was presented. LQM advised officers and the council that there was sufficient information to allow outline consent to be granted. In terms of the decision by the planning committee to refuse permission, there was no evidence presented contrary to that in terms of the robustness of that. We're having a debate now, but the position is, in terms of that evidence, it's a peer review of the work we've done by LQM.
We approached LQM first.
Can I just, the gentleman down here, wanted to speak.
Councillor for Somercotes, the planning board go on training, robust training on how to assess any planning. And on 2 occasions, they turned it down onto the information they had received. So what you're really telling me that planning board members are relevant, is that what you're saying?
No, but decisions have to be based on available evidence.
Well, that's the evidence. They looked at the evidence and they decided to turn it down. The planning board members represent the wider community, and it's the wider community and councillors who should be making the decision.
While you're talking about that, can I just ask the question to Ray G? Why are the council not defending the decision of the planning committee? It is the voice of the people. Pardon?
Yeah, I think it's to do with financially we can't do it. That's in my opinion. I spoke to a councillor who a councillor can, barrister, look at the information. I think it's just to do that we do not want to spend the money on this inquiry. Every other authority, when a planning board turns it down, they will defend it. This council does not.
When did it last happen? Can you respond to that, Ray G?
Following the refusal, the application was discussed at full council, and members voted on whether they wanted to contest the appeal or not. They voted that they didn't want to contest the appeal, and it's on that basis that we haven't put a case forward in LQM or not here, because the council decision was not to contest the appeal.
Anyway, I was approached on the 20th of May.
Financially.
I've looked at it, I am an expert in this field, and I do not accept that it is sufficiently robust enough and there's enough information. So someone else, who is an expert in this field, disagrees with you and disagrees with LQM.
Yeah.
Who is an expert in site investigation, is an expert in undertaking contaminated land investigations. So, and I didn't start out on the basis that that's what I expected to find, by the way. That is not what I expected to find.
Okay. Now, can I just take a note of the lady's name sitting next to me?
Oh, Linda Coleman.
And so just to point that the statement of common ground sets out the decision trail in terms of the reasons why the council decided not to contest the appeal.
Yes, and there's also a correspondence where it's like a veiled threat, where the statement says it is inevitable that you will award me costs. That's in black and white. And that's not really the correct tone for this process, is it? And that's in the case study. So everyone's seen sight of it. So it's now common knowledge.
But also, going back, the Borough Council sold the land to David Ashley Construction, and they're implicated in it right through. So, can we have an explanation for that? How did that happen?
Yes.
LQM's report quite rightly suggests the council are well within the rights to turn that down for insufficient information.
Can I take a note of your name, please?
Richard Barnsley.
Can we just ask what report that is, because that's not what we...
It is peer review or the final assumption.
This one here?
I don't know, I can't see from down there.
I mean, I've actually got a copy of the resolved final reason why they said no, and I can read it out. But what I think's odd is, in your case study, you don't repeat this. You actually use a line that it's not appropriate, they say insufficient evidence, but that's not the case. That was actually said in black and white, it's public domain.
Sorry.
Resolved, the outline planning permission is refused in respect of this application for the following reasons. The local planning authority considers that it is not being demonstrated that the site can be adequately be remediated from ground contamination to the detriment of public health, contrary to the provisions of paragraphs 109, 120, 121 and 122 of the National Planning Policy Framework, which state that sites are suitable for their intended use. So it seems strange.
Can I just clear some? Because I was actually at both meetings and I voted to refuse it. I don't apologise for that one little bit. And as as the gentleman's just said, at the first meeting, I actually gave about 7 reasons for it to be turned down. And Ray G and Sarah Johnson said no. You don't need that many. You really need 3 or 4 that are really robust. So the planning board then agreed that it was 109, 120, 121 and 122. The reasons to actually turn this application down. Now, through a so-called technicality, and Mr. Potter decided that this planning application would have to come to the following month's planning board. When I phoned Mr. Potter, I tried to get some sense out of it, and he said that you received a letter, but it's confidential. And I asked at the next meeting, the full meeting of the planning board, can I reveal the contents of this letter? And Mr. Potter said in no uncertain terms, no. Now, I think most people do know now why it actually came to the planning board again, even though it's ambiguous and it doesn't make sense to me. There's something wrong. There's something simply wrong in this building. But I'm not going to say who I think it is. And at the second meeting, it was Councillor Wilson that actually recommended that it be refused for insufficient information being available. In other words, we needed more site analysis, we needed more information from the firm that never turns their side down, and we weren't happy. Now, planning members then got no advice whatsoever from Ray G or Sarah Johnson. They more or less sat on their hands and said, that's good enough. In other words, insufficient information available was a good enough reason to turn it down, completely ignoring the reasons 109, 120, 121 and 122, which I partly blame myself because we should have added them on, because they were the main reasons why we turned it down in the first place. And then we have this authority that won't defend decisions of elected councillors. It's ridiculous. We even went to full council. My colleague here,
I moved the motion.
He moved the motion
that we defend this appeal, and supporting the planning board.
The council turned it down. So here we are today. The reason why this public inquiry is simply because one person decided that the reasons for turning it down wasn't robust enough on the second application night, and then you got no support from planning officers whatsoever. It's unbelievable. That turns things on its head. What happened that second night, and I was ashamed at what some of the comments has been levelled at me for just taking a democratic decision on actually something that's right and something that's wrong, and for defending local people. I find it disgusting that we're actually having to sit at this meeting today when this application should have been turned down without even appeal.
I think something else.
Can I just obviously point you to Appendix 3 of the statement of case, which sets out the decision notice and the reason for refusal. And also, my understanding of the further advice provided to council was legal advice in relation to the case, which is obviously privileged information.
So it's recently come to light, but I must admit I was shocked when I found this out, because I didn't know this until this morning. Allegedly, the planning manager of this council has recused herself of any involvement to do with these 2 planning applications, because there are 2, and this word has been created to join these spurious planning applications together, which is the word in tandem. Well, I understand the tandem to be 2 people sat on the same bicycle frame.
Sorry, can you clarify which is the other planning application?
It's the one for the proposed redevelopment of the rugby club to the bidding site.
Okay.
I've got the numbers somewhere. But the point is, Sarah Johnson is the planning manager, and she's recused herself, and obviously she doesn't want to be involved in the process, but I'm keen to find out what is her interest or involvement with these 2 planning applications.
She's got a vested interest.
Because the
She
2
was
chief
removed.
planning officers are representing themselves, but the planning manager isn't here.
I think we're these are sort of matters of matters for council, really. I mean, I'm just here just to examine the issues surrounding the actual case itself, rather than the process for the council's consideration of the application. I note the comments that you've made, but I would like to just concentrate on the technical issues. Have we covered everything? Have we covered all that people want to cover in relation to ground conditions?
Can I just ask one quick question?
Yeah.
If this outline planning permission goes ahead today and you've got some further works to do, are LQM reviewing that? And who will be reviewing it for Amber Valley? Because as I understand, we don't have a geoscientific officer.
We've got a scientific officer here.
Is she the only
A
officer?
qualified
She's not
scientific
chief.
officer.
She's got a PhD, yeah.
Right, okay. So will LQM...
Qualified.
Instructed by the council.
Right, okay, so will LQM
But
review
I'll be
reviewing
involved in the
anything?
process. I've got a master's degree, and LQM will be involved in the process as they have been so far.
Right, okay.
We both got masters degree, both chartered.
Okay.
Mr. Fryer, are there any other points relating to ground contamination?
No, in terms of the ground contamination, I think it really then just moves on to whether the condition, I think of them, the condition, or proposed conditions, as I understand it, they were draft, but they are proposed, is that right?
Well, I think they've been suggested by the council, and I think they've been discussed, and I think the basis for the conditions have been agreed with the appellant as well.
So the only other issue was then, as I think I wrote in the introduction to that part, was notwithstanding all that went above, can this go down by conditions? And then it was whether these 4 environmental conditions, I don't know how long the actual conditions are, the 4 environmental conditions can and would be able to control it as written. The point being that, of course, they could be rewritten, potentially, but as given. So that was then the issue I looked at there. I don't know whether you want me to speak first or on those.
On the conditions?
Yeah.
Well, we'll have a separate session on the conditions. We'll go through each of the conditions in detail. Does the appellant wish to say anything else on ground conditions? No? Okay. It's 1:45, so I'm suggesting that we take a break for lunch. I'm also mindful that the weather might change, and I don't want to leave it, if we leave it till late afternoon for the site visit. Yeah.
That's in Wellington.
Yeah, I have got some glasses, yeah. Shall we take, is it a convenient time for a lunch break now and then to meet on site?
Yep.
Straight afterwards?
Yes, I think that would be...
Yep.
Are we coming back to discuss afterwards?
Yes, so we can come back here afterwards, yeah.
Because there's lots to go over yet.
Yes, oh yeah, I appreciate, yes, there's other issues to discuss around these list of conditions, and we have a planning obligation document as well. Okay. Now, if we meet on site at say 1:45, would that be
Yep.
convenient?
Yes, I think that would be fine.
What time back here?
Well,
See how long it takes.
and then if we met back here at say 3 o'clock.
Yeah.
And do any members of the public want to go on the site visit? The purpose of the site visit really is to point things out for me to see, physical features, anything that you want me to see while I'm on site. I've already had a walk around the area, but does anyone want to attend the site visit?
Yeah, you should go.
Okay.
Jason, you should go as well.
Right, you're taking me.
Yeah, site of eyes, haven't you?
No,
There's loads of people go, but you need to go and start from that.
Does the appellant have any objection if Mrs. Preston comes? Okay. Where's the best place to meet? Do we drive straight into the rugby club car?
Excuse me. It's the Valley Rugby Club.